All right, fantastic. Let's get going. Everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Brandon Lee. I help run events here at GeoTech. Just a little bit of stuff, a little bit of information about GeoTech. What we do essentially is we bring together these incredible speakers and we put together these fantastic research programs. Essentially, just really trying to get at the intersection between tech and intelligence and national security, tech and politics, I guess I should really say. And part of that program is done through our speaker events, talking through GeoTechs or GeoTech Talks. And today I'm super excited to be introducing to you our third speaker for GeoTech Talks, Nii Simmonds. Everyone, if you could join me in a little bit of a virtual round of applause. Just a little bit of background on Nii before we get started. Nii, actually, Nii, I think I'll go ahead and let you sort of self-introduce. I think that makes a little more sense just for the crowd that we're working with here. So, Nii, I'll hand it off to you.
Sure. First of all, good afternoon, and I want to thank you and Pranav to invite me to this um, to these series to share what I know and give a little bit of delve into some of these things that are near and dear to our trade competitiveness and national security efforts. I have to say, I I've seen the other speakers or videos before me, and I'm in a esteemed company, so I'm looking forward to sharing what I know about the intersection between semiconductors and critical rare earth minerals. I'm sorry if I'm slurring. I just got back from the dentist a little bit ago, so I've my general anesthesia is wearing off, so I'm slurring. So excuse me if I sound like I'm chewing gum. Anyways, so about me, I wear a couple of hats. I'm a non-resident fellow for the Center for Global Development. I used to be at the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center, uh, same name as uh, this series, and I'm also a global expert for the World Economic Forum's advanced manufacturing and digital transformation sectors. I've got a really broad background in development finance, economic development, various international organizations like the World Bank Group, IFC, and African Development Bank. So I've seen done a lot in emerging and frontier markets. A big part of my work is in Africa, Southeast Asia, and done a little bit of work in the Caribbean. Um, you know, and that's and there's a lot going on globally, and some of these countries are have moved their GDP based on their economic growth. And I think there's a time and a place where we all have to look at these countries and give them props and commend them for making great economic moves. Other countries probably need to do a little better, but what better way to talk about some of these things in a context of advanced manufacturing semiconductors?
Absolutely.
Brandon, I'll leave it on to you.
Absolutely, Nii. Thanks so much for that fantastic introduction to what we're talking about today. You brought up a couple different regions around the world that are really seeing a lot of not only sort of potential for advancement, but a lot of current growth, especially in the emerging tech region. And of course, today we're talking a little bit about semiconductors. Just to give a preface for everyone, we're going to be discussing this idea of advanced packaging, which is a specific type or a specific step in the process of working with semiconductors. Nii can give us some more information on that step. But the idea really is looking at African countries, African nations, looking at the sort of untapped potential of not only their rare earth minerals or their other critical mineral reserves, but also in our abilities to help develop infrastructure and help develop advanced packaging industries in these nations. And Nii really, Nii, you feel quite strongly about sort of the potential that this might have for the United States and for our allies. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think the COVID exposed a lot to our social fabric, but also the vulnerabilities to our supply chains, whether it's healthcare supply chain, um, consumer, industrial, military, and all those sectors I mentioned would not be would not be powered without Africa's critical rare earth minerals. So Africa controls or Africa has a third of the critical rare earth minerals that are used in our consumer, industrial, and military sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to add a little bit of more substance, and Nii, this will lead into my first real question here. According to a CSIS report, Africa likely possesses nearly half of the world's cobalt reserves, as well as major shares in platinum, copper, manganese, and other rare earth minerals. Just thinking about this in terms of the critical earth space, how do you think the USG or the US government sees Africa? Do you think that we're looking at it as more, we're looking at the continent as more of a partnership, as a place for partnerships, or just a place to take advantage of the resources that we have there?
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question, Ren. I would say the US has evolved its relationship in Africa. Africa is not the most is not the most easiest place to work. There's challenges, but there's also opportunities.
Right.
And I think what you see now compared to what you see maybe 30, 40 years ago is you see more US not only USG investment, but you see US private sector investment. You know, you look at it across the continent, mostly in English speaking countries, you have companies like Google, Alphabet with Google, Microsoft, and IBM who have R&D centers in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya. Now, if you put an R&D center in a frontier market like Africa,
Mhm.
that's a big bet. You're taking part of your balance sheet to say, hey, we think there's innovation here, or we think there's something here, we just don't know. On a USG perspective, you know, um, USAID, ODA, official development assistance, that's been going on for a while now. What you've seen most recently in the past, I would say about 10 years or so, is catalyzing private sector catalyzing private sector investments or catalyzing the private sector, right? Other donors, Western donors, GIZ, the old DIFA, which is FCDO, USA, are now saying, hey, how do we catalyze private sector? Now, USG has done a decent job through entities like DFC, which is the U.S. government's DFI. It's a newly created entity, the old OPIC, where they're making investments in not only critical minerals, but they're also there's this infrastructure program called the Breeder Corridor, where I think is taking having a pathway to get critical rare earth minerals from, I believe, Mozambique, Congo, and to ship it to Western ports so that it can be processed and then it can be used
Mm.
in our Western supply chain. So there's a lot that's going on. What I'm arguing is that's nice, but in an area of strategic competition or geopolitical competition with China, we have to be very, if we're trying to get into good graces of a frontier market like Africa, which is 1.5 billion, and
Yeah.
Africa has 54, 55 countries.
Yeah.
There's francophone, there's anglophone, there's lusophone, there's divide between the Sahel. Africa is a very diverse
Mm.
continent, over 5,000 languages,
Yeah.
uh, customs, um, and there's nuances to doing business. It's not easy place, but if you can make it inroads, you
Right.
could you can really change some dynamics. I will say this before I finish up. As a, right now, we're presently the African continent is about 1.5 billion people,
Mm.
and based on who you talk to, the figures will be another billion people will come online in the next 20, 25 years. So 2.5 billion people. So not only is there a market opportunity with the demographic, but disposable incomes are going to rise, right? So you're actually seeing
Mm.
Chinese and even Indian multinationals making inroads. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, hey, how can we get more? I mentioned those three companies, Alphabet with its Google subsidiary, Microsoft, and IBM. Those are
Yep.
three countries that have a good global footprint. But what about other U.S. multinationals? What are they doing to look at Africa as a destination so that we can secure critical earth minerals and make that matter to our um, consumer, industrial, and military sectors?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nii. I really appreciate that you brought up some of these private and public inroads that are already being developed. I just had a few questions. You brought in other foreign countries, other foreign interests, especially China, in terms of our global strategic competition. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the Chinese presence in Africa, specifically through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, and more recently with the provision of surveillance tech in Nairobi in Kenya. And also, obviously, in terms of global competition, there's also quite a strong Russian presence in terms of the mining in the African continent as well. As far as you can tell, are Russia and China interested in becoming partners with these countries, or are they simply taking advantage of their resources? What are some things that we should take note of in their approaches, and what are some things that we should improve on in terms of developing our own inroads and partnerships?
Yeah, Brandon, that's about three questions. I'll try to answer it. So about you know about China, um, I think we have to acknowledge what China has done in Africa.
Yeah.
Without China, there won't probably be the infrastructure that you see on the continent, especially with roads, bridges, hospitals, and there's even airport infrastructure. So let me just say that the infrastructure without China, Africa wouldn't be where it is. Even one of my parents are from Ghana.
Hmm.
Yes, there's U.S. government has built some has supported some really interesting infrastructure projects through MCC and other U.S. government entities, but the Chinese have done way more,
Yeah.
right? And and they use their state-owned enterprises, and yeah, they use their people. It's really not knowledge transfer. So I just want to put that out there because I'm in DC, and I think oftentimes when I talk to people on the Hill and other elected officials, and they do bring up China, China as the adversary, and I have to say, look, this is what they're doing. But in terms of the surveillance, I'm not going to really talk about that. All I can say is, yes, in this era of geopolitical gamesmanship,
Hmm.
um, are the Chinese are Chinese multinationals? Do they have a intro, or do they have a strong links with the CCP and
Yeah.
yes, I'm sure that they're doing some things, and I'm sure there's surveillance. But one of the things I say to a lot of people is, hey, that's the issue about government's accountability. If some of these governments were to be more accountable to their people,
Right.
they understand that the deals are signing, they're not mortgaging their future. So that's the surveillance. Then I don't really want to talk about that because I'm not expert in that. But in terms of Russia, I mean, a lot of people don't realize it, but Russia has been in Africa since going back to the start of even before the Cold War. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, he was Ghana was sort of the pathway for a lot of Africans to go to the ex-Soviet Union to become doctors and engineers. A lot of those guys came back with training in civil engineering and medical sciences and what have you. So the Russian government or the Soviet state has had a good partnership and footprint across the African continent.
Hmm.
Present day, I mean, when you talk about critical rare minerals, people bring up Wagner or the old Wagner, which is now actually folded into um, the Kremlin, right? They are, if you look at, unfortunately, there's been in some of these countries, most of the Sahel states, you have seen the coups that have taken place. A lot of these countries
Right.
who have juntas have partnered with Russia because, and the partnership is really on military, but the Russian government also has other agreements for critical minerals and other things. So, and I have to say this because a lot of people don't realize it, but a lot of these countries, you have to ask yourself, why are they having the coups? It's because they have thought the French government
Yeah.
have not treating them well, and when I say that is when you look at the Cold War, when the Cold War ended, even before the Cold War, right after independence, a lot of the countries that were English sort of were cut their links to the English state, but they still were part of the Commonwealth, right?
Mhm.
The French countries, unfortunately, were forced to put a percentage of their foreign currency in the French treasury, right?
Mhm.
And if they
Oh,
were to find a mineral, the French government gets a right to first refusal. So a lot of these countries over time said, we're not getting we're not we're providing all these critical minerals to France or Belgium, and we're not seeing a benefit.
yeah.
So you've seen coups that have happened in the past 2 or 3 years, and there's been others. So
Yep.
yeah, and then to capsulate that, I'm trying to remember the last part you asked me. Um, you asked me about China. You asked me about Russia.
Right.
I think here's the last part. I think one of the things as Americans we have to acknowledge is the days of us sort of countries. If you look at most countries, they still look at us in high regard, right? They expect U.S. leadership when it comes to private sector. They expect U.S. leadership. Oftentimes, when there's a national disaster, who do most people come to? They come to us, right? Because we're so given. But I think one of the things in this geopolitical gamesmanship, one of the things that we have to also acknowledge is that China is also the other elephant in the room, and I think we also need to find ways we could partner with China. I don't agree with everything China does. I think some of the things they do is it's very questionable, especially when it comes to um, you know around the Belt Road Initiative. Is no they've kind of phased that out. They have a new initiative going on, but yeah, a lot of these countries that have developed a lot of infrastructure, they're quite in debt. Not just Africa, but Latin America,
Yeah.
um, South Asia. You look at Sri Lanka, they couldn't make a debt payment, and the Chinese have said, "Hey, look, maybe we can use your port." So the Chinese are an opaque government, and they're doing what they can. They're looking at their interests, right? Just as we, as the U.S. government, look at our interests, right? So that's what I wanted to convene and say.
Yeah, absolutely. Nii, I think those are some really, really good points for us to jump off and continue. Just for some added context, since we talked a bit about the Sahel, Nii, you were referencing a lot of the coups that happened in 2020, 2023 in Mali, Burkina Faso, Mauritius, a lot of these francophone African nations that
No,
you
not Mauritius, not Mauritius.
apologies. Yeah, sorry. So we're talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, and I think there's one more, right? In the Sahel.
So there's Guinea, there's Mali, there's Burkina Faso, and then there's Gabon.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. And on the point about sort of the relationship between a foreign government and an African country, we talked a little bit just now about China's relationship or Russia's relationship being in terms of knowledge exchange. Before we get into ATP, before we get into chips and infrastructure development, I want to ask you, how important do you think it is for the United States in future to be able to develop connections with African nations that aren't just knowledge exchange based, that aren't just infrastructure development based? How well do you think that US private interest or US public interest should get to know the sort of people that they're working with, if that makes sense?
Sure, I think I mean the U.S. government is late to the table.
Mm,
Countries like India and we I didn't even talk about India. India has done quite a bit of work. Actually, I think they've done more than even in the Russia did a lot of work out during the Cold War. India has done quite a bit, but China, overtakes all those countries because of the infrastructure, right? When you build something you can see, you can touch, it's quite different than we as Americans that provide U.S. aid or we provide old official development assistance through USA. But in terms of how important is it for USG to incentivize our private sector? There are some efforts. There needs to be more.
right.
Um, for instance, the CHIPS Act. And there's after COVID, this whole thing about mitigating your supply chain and the China plus one concept of what can you what countries can be the what countries that are that share our values or have certain aspects to support consumer electronics or support the semiconductor supply chain. What countries could we partner with that can that can mitigate our risk profile to China.
Yeah.
Africa is not part of that conversation. So I think I've written some articles about this, myself and other colleagues, and we're just trying to say to the rest of the world, look, you can't just look at Africa as a, a um, a destination just take critical minerals and say, oh yeah, China's doing it, but you're doing the same thing. You have to you have to focus on value addition. You have to focus on vocational or workforce development. And as I said before, and about 10 minutes before, as a content scales from 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion, what does that mean?
Right.
It's a huge consumer class, disposable income are going to rise. Countries like Nigeria, which is like 220 million, are going to double. You know,
Oh,
Egypt's going to double. Ethiopia, all these countries are going to double. That's a huge market opportunity. A
yeah.
lot of these people are going to tertiary institutions. They're learning to code online. Google is doing some really interesting efforts. So is Microsoft. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, look, the market opportunity is there,
Mm.
right? If if our if our competitors, i.e., China and ally India, are doing things, what do we also need to do to build a brand name in some of these countries? Because some of these countries, they want to develop. They don't really necessarily need ODA. Let me rephrase that. They necessarily don't want ODA, but they don't have a choice because maybe they're not doing a good job to collect tax revenue. They have poor governance, so they have to go to the IMF, World Bank. But in an era of geopolitical competition, if we're trying to secure these critical minerals, and some of these guys, Zimbabwe, for instance, right? They said that they no longer will allow um, certain critical rare earth, not certain. They won't allow non-value added critical rare earth minerals to leave that country. They made a provision for China because basically they're in debt to China, you know. But if we're building a strategic partnership with which is value is a shared interest value partnership where we have acts that have been passed by Congress. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, or if the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a misnomer, is really a Green Deals, and then the CHIPS Act, right? All those three provisions have partnerships with allies. So the CHIPS Act, right there, we have provisions in that CHIPS Act to partner with democratic or strategic partnerships. Africa is not being courted for that. So these are things that we need to do, and we need to look at from a different standpoint than we have done before.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think what you bring up now really sets us up to talk a little bit more about what we came to talk about today, which is the chips industry and working the chips industry into this sort of idea of partnerships. Nii, the sort of industry that you're looking at to develop these relationships is through the ATP or advanced testing and packaging industry. Is that right?
Yeah. So yeah, for those who don't know, ATP is just assembly test and packaging. It's a term that's mostly used for semiconductors, but I think that some other consumer electronics companies use it when tier 2 and 3 manufacturers make it to a final assembly, and then you have to test it and that sort of thing. The semiconductor supply chain is quite complex, but yeah, you're right. So uh, I guess your question was, how can Africa be a part of that?
Well, I guess my question is, what about ATP makes it a good business for us to help develop infrastructure? Or yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So for ATP, I mean the top. I mean, I wrote some notes before I talked. The top countries for ATP are the Southeast Asian countries. They control about 20% of the market. China's 30%. Taiwan's 27, and then Korea, Costa Rica, and then a few other countries. And basically, what ATP really stands for, give everybody context. When the chips are made, right? And the to make a semiconductor, nobody can own all of the semiconductor supply chain. We created a chip out in Silicon Valley and in Southern California, but there's so many players. There's the equipment providers, ASML, with the huge lithography machines that are like a bus. You have people that provide the gases, and then you have the processors, which in this case is China, and then you have other players. But once the chips are made through the lithograph and then it's etched and all that, you have the wafer, right? And then you cut it up. guess what? After the wafer is done, um, not some of these wafers they're faulty, and they may not turn out to be perfect. Well, you have to test it, you have to assembly them, and you have to package it, right? So it's a long process to get to that final assembly where it's in your electric vehicle, or it's in the white goods, like whether it's a refrigerator or what have you. Um, and so there's a lot of opportunity for the African continent. And I was just watching a video early today. Company like Arm Holdings. There's they have there's been 250 based on their arms Arm Holdings, which it's a private company now. The architecture to make some of the chips, they hold the license for it, and the instructions. Something like 250 billion chips have been made using their architecture, right? And then you have the x86, that's the uh, Intel AMD, right? So these two architectures, x86, which is Intel AMD, and then you have the you have ARMS. Once the chips are made, you have countries that are testing it. So if you're a graduate from a STEM program, whether you're from the Philippines or Costa Rica or wherever you have an opportunity to get a job. What I'm arguing is Africa needs to be given the same type of opportunities that some of these other countries have been gotten, especially also to mitigate our risk profile to some countries, right?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think Nii, that provides a nice through line between what you brought up about what's already going on in Africa and also the nature of ATP itself. We talked about how private firms are doing these technical training programs for coding. So if we can introduce these two sort of how do you say architectures for chips and assist. Oh, there we go. All right, all good. And it's assist in the training for this sort of for this know-how. And then on top of that, ATP is a very, very labor heavy, labor intensive market. So it makes a lot of sense that as you're bringing up this idea that there are going to be more and more folks, more and more hands for labor in the African continent, ATP, in my opinion, makes actually a lot of sense. And so, as I've studied chips myself, I can't believe when we first talked, I couldn't believe that I never thought about Africa as a place to near shore, especially given its proximity to all these, extremely valuable rare earth minerals. I just had a few other questions. I think right before we'll try and open it up for questions sometime soon because I wanted this to be a little bit more conversational with the sort of people coming on. But you mentioned that, obviously Africa is a beautifully diverse place, but that does make it difficult for the development of infrastructure or the development of sort of, how do I say, maybe training technologies or things like that. For example, how do you account for stuff like in one country, there's multiple ethnic groups and multiple languages. You have to develop a training program for each person or for each type of people, right? And so, what are some of the infrastructural hurdles that you think we face in terms of developing a relatively high tech endeavor like ATP in Africa?
Sure, sure. Interesting question. Look, Africans are not different than Indian demographic or the Chinese demographic. I mean, in India is 1.5 billion people, and there's you have the south, you have the north, you have the middle, it's also Muslim. It's quite diverse, right? And even though you have the diversity, most people who go to a tertiary program or institute, they learn English, right? Which is like the global business language. Same thing in Africa, right? The English countries, everybody's learning English. You speak your local dialect where if you're going to a village, that sort of thing. And the only challenge is Francophone Africa where they speak French. But if you go to a tertiary institution in most Francophone countries, or some, I shouldn't say most, some Africa Francophone countries, I think a good percentage they understand working level of English. So that's not an issue. And then you have the Lusophone countries, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde. Um, you know, so you know, there's Africa is diverse, yes, but it's not different than a country like India, right? So there's you know, I just want to say that.
Yeah. No, I think that absolutely. And apologies if that came off in any way. I was
Oh
just
no. I think I need to just sort of I get asked I wouldn't say I get asked that the question you raise is more of usually people say, well, what about corruption or base load electricity? I mean, some countries, especially the landlocked countries, are power deficient by like 60%, right? Burundi, they have to get their electricity for ESCOM, which is a South African government-backed utility, and they've been in the red for God knows how long. So um, the continent is a big continent with, as I said, 5,000 languages. Um, we haven't even talked about connectivity with broadband. To learn, you need broadband. You need so yeah, there's challenges, but there's also opportunities. I mean, let's not forget in the 70s and 80s, we helped set up the microelectronics supply chain. When I say we, the U.S. government or the U.S. multinationals, HP, um, Intel, TI, Texas Instruments, they set up vocational training and production facilities in Southeast Asia. It was mostly because of labor arbitrage, right? But they saw the opportunity to go there. What I'm arguing, others are arguing, Africa needs to be given the same um, opportunity. I would say this is that we're not even talking about semiconductors, we're even talking about the green transition.
right.
The Inflation Reduction Act. In there's a provision to focus on green our houses and making this more efficient. Um, you know, all these battery materials, they come from Africa. You mentioned cobalt. There's not, I mean, cobalt is one thing, but there are other materials that material scientists and others are looking at that come from Africa that pack a much more higher density, power density than
Right.
lithium and cobalt. I mean, there's this new, there's some talk about using solid state batteries. I don't know when that's going to happen, but the battery evolution will change. And then last but not least, military applications, right? We need certain materials to make fiber optics faster or to support our our military industrial complex, our submarines, our F-35 jet that we use so there are a lot of things that we're doing, and I'm arguing, hey, look, it's time that we look at African countries to manufacture components so that we can it's like teaching men to fish so they can fish forever. We're supporting them, and they know how to do things, and they can create jobs. Maybe we don't have to use our taxpayer dollars to support through USA to support some of these countries, right?
Yeah.
So that's the argument I'm making.
Yeah, Nii, I think your case is very clear. I think it's super solid. So what really surprises me at this point is why more policymakers or more folks on the Hill really haven't adopted this mindset. So I guess my question to you is, and this will be the last one before we open up for questions. Is there anything about the U.S. attitude that needs to change, or maybe opinions or viewpoints about African nations that needs to change in order for us to bring about this change that you're suggesting?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, as I said before, 25 minutes ago, there's a lot going on through the U.S. government. And maybe they don't do a good job to market themselves. I had a meet with somebody from USA about a week ago, and one of the things I said is, I didn't know that you guys were doing this. And she said, yeah, that's we need to do a better job. There's so many things going on the ground, not just in Africa, but Latin America, in the South Pacific, um, and we just don't do a good job. Or let me face it, the U.S. government doesn't have they don't do a good job to market themselves or what have you, right? Um, but there's the only time you hear about something is when it's on the news and it's nefarious, right? But when it's something that's good, it's unfortunate, and that's just a news cycle, right? There was this huge U.S. has a state summit, probably about it's been this month coming this November has been 2 years since that happened, and all these African heads of states were here. This first time that I've seen, and there was a previous head of state summit during I think the second Obama term. The U.S. government opened up its doors. The Exim Bank, DFC, all these U.S. government agencies open up the door to support African governments' economic development plans, trade, and there are so many trade deals and economic deals. And the U.S. government doesn't have a choice but to do that because we're late to the game because of what China has done, right? Could we do more? Of course, right? But what I'm arguing is, we don't have infinite resources, especially in this election cycle.
Yeah.
But can we incentivize our multinationals to, extend part of their supply chain to the African government? Let me go back to what I said earlier. Google, Alphabet, Google,
Mm.
Microsoft, and IBM have R&D centers in Africa, right? These guys have had R&D centers around the world for years. And in the past, maybe, I think IBM has had an R&D center for about 15 years, but in the past, I would say 10 years, you're seeing an R&D center. When you put an R&D center in the frontier market, you're telling your shareholder, right? Hey, we think there's innovation here, right? We
Absolutely.
think there's something here that can be $1 billion line item. We don't know, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Folks, please join me in giving Nii another warm round of applause. Thank you so much, Nii, for that fantastic round of answering my questions and giving us a really great case for why Africa should be more strongly considered and at the forefront, really, of what we're looking in terms of onshoring, in terms of tech partnerships, in terms of developing these things over time. With that, I'd love to open it up to questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand virtually, and then you can and I can call on you and you can unmute. Otherwise, we can sort of continue the conversation more free flow. Nii, if there's anything that you missed out on that you wanted to say, but before that, I think Pranav has a question for us actually. So Pranav, go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Nii, thank you so much. This is really, really helpful. I think one question I have is looking at the innovation ecosystem within Africa right now. One area that is super interesting for us that we don't see as much in the US is that because you don't see these like legacy systems, right? Like legacy, for instance, payment systems or like older systems there. It's been interesting to see how some innovations have popped up that are able to serve so many people at extremely low cost that could probably never emerge in the US because of how many like legacy players exist. I'm looking, for instance, at online payments, and that's something we've seen in India as well, some of these e-payments platforms that are emerging. So I guess just like reflecting on that, are there kind of lessons that we here in the US, the West, can draw from the innovations that are happening domestically within these African countries? Because that's something that I think we could work on a lot here as well.
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, I like how you phrase that, Pranav. I mean, I would also say, you know, um, look, I mean, Africa is not different from India. I mean, I hear a lot of Indians who have done work in Africa have said, I remember India 10 or 15 years ago, and this is where Africa is. It wasn't too far, it wasn't too long ago where India was borrowing quite a bit of money from the World Bank and IMF. These days, I'm not sure if the Indian government is actually using all their allocation from the World Bank. Just give you a term, give you a take on how the World Bank works. Each country gets an allocation how much it can borrow for healthcare or energy or what have you. I think India over time has sort of, I'm not sure if they're borrowing. China doesn't need to borrow anymore. I think the last time they borrowed money from the World Bank was by like 2010. Now they look at technical assistance and like climate change or climate adaptation, right? So China can, write paper like we do through the Fed, right? And they can self-invest, or they can, China can do things that we're doing through the Federal Reserve and Treasury. Now, innovation is if you go to any marketplace, where it's Kinshasa or Nairobi, you'll see people who are hacking or come up with innovations to solve a local challenge, right? they may not speak, they may not know how to read or write, but they know how to weld, they know how to hack. You know, those are people that we can put them in a formal training, and then they can be a tier 1 or 2 supplier to like a Volkswagen or a Ford. Those are types of things that I think can bring some of these local groups into a global context, right? So those are types of things that you're seeing. And I'm glad you talk about the payments. The payments, you know, fintech is, I got a few friends that run early stage funds, and I think probably half their portfolio are fintech startups. And I think the industry me personally, I think the industry needs to be consolidated. I think there's so much overlap. And then you could talk about crypto, but Africa, the reason why you're seeing so many fintech and financial service companies is because we don't have sophisticated capital markets, right? We have a credit system. You know, we have we don't really have we have a cash system, but things aren't on our credit unless you're rich and you're just paying things on cash. In Africa, everything's on cash, right? So if things are if you have a cash-based economy and people are traditionally holding their cash under their pillow or their bed or in their closet, and you can safeguard their cash so that the money that they were given, they're actually given hard currency or send hard currency to somebody, give somebody in the rural village. But now you can do it through Momo, which is a nice term to talk about sending money through SMS. That is a game changer, right? But that is something that's been going on for about 15 years. Now you're talking about other sophisticated solutions like digital identity. How do you take a digital identity and use that so that you can get public services, you know, or get a license or what have you? I'm going off a tangent, but the innovation in Africa is blossoming strong. You're seeing hacker spaces, you're seeing maker spaces. So there's a lot going on that it's interesting. It's vibrant, you know, and there's an opportunity to even get some of these spaces that are informal. If somebody can find a way to formalize it, a company like Volkswagen or Toyota would be very interested to partner and work with some of these. And I tried to do this when I was at African Development Bank. We were trying to get people who are making things on the side of the road, chairs or tables, to get them connected to a IKEA supply chain so that IKEA can support and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, Pranav, thanks for that great question. Yeah, Pranav, thanks for a great question. I want to put the public bet out there to see if anyone can top it. I think it's super cool to think about drawing innovations from countries, especially, thinking about leapfrogging in a lot of places where that don't have sort of legacy or vested interests. So, Nii, I really appreciate the answer as well. So as I said, open for questions. Um, so feel free to raise your hands. Nii, as we're sort of waiting, I wonder if you can talk to me a little bit more about the direct connections we can build between companies that are already existing that are working on mining for these sort of critical earth minerals and companies that we want to sort of plan and build. Like obviously these are two different industries, but what are the connections that maybe we can leverage and use to help develop or ease the sort of transition of infrastructure for high tech for what we already have, which is sort of the mining industry, and then transition that into maybe a high tech manufacturing or application industry.
Yeah. I'm not an extractive expert. I could say that the big companies, you have the Swiss company Glencore, they're all over the world. You have uh, um, what is the Australian one? Um, is it BHP? You have all these guys. They're all over. They're in Australia. They're in Latin America. Um, they're in parts of Africa. Unfortunately, some of the American companies have found it difficult to operate in Africa because of um,
Hmm.
governance challenges. You know, we have this thing called the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. If you don't know, Google it. If you're an American citizen and you're found guilty of bribing somebody, you can be punished by the Justice Department. And So you're seeing the extractive business is very opaque, I have to say. But that's not what I focus on. I focus on more on how can we get some of these countries to, and some of these countries, they now they're in the past year or two, they're saying, yeah, we want to focus on value addition. We want to focus, because if you look at country like Nigeria, we just found a huge lithium deposit, same thing in Ghana.
Right.
They noticed that this electric vehicle transition, a company like Tesla is doing quite well. And if you can make battery packs in Nigeria and then ship it to Texas or Oakland, where Tesla has its factory, then they can take part of that economic value addition, right? So a lot of these countries are seeing what's going on around the world, and they're saying, well, okay, well, what about us? You can't just take our vibranium, right? You,
Right.
you just can't take our vibranium from Wakanda and not put value added, right? So, yeah, yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I think very much so. I think it makes sense that the most logical thing to do, and you mentioned this also while answering Pranav's question, is to help connect currently existing supply chains to the things that they need, or things that can be provided by African nations. So I think that makes total sense. Sort of off topic now. I'm curious about your work currently at as the executive director for the Diaspora Country Index. So can you tell us a little bit just briefly about what you do there
Sure.
and yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sure. So I wear a couple of hats, as I said. So DCI, I was away for 4 years, got back 3 years ago. Was in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire for African Development Bank. They stole me away, or they headhunted me away from the World Bank and IFC, and then I was there for 2 years. Meanwhile, I was doing work in Indonesia, Romania. I was doing a lot of work around the world, but then I moved to Ghana, and then the pandemic hit, and I stayed there. But one of the things I was realizing was the opportunity for the diaspora to be a force multiplier, and how countries were not utilizing their diaspora for development purposes. So one of the things I have, myself and my other my colleagues in my advisory board, we have basically an entity focused on helping partner countries to engage their diaspora. It's kind of like a Peace Corps for diaspora engagement, and we rank countries on their ability to engage their diaspora for the SDGs. And based on how you fall on an index, if Rwanda or Rwanda is known for like the tech hub, right? Same thing in Nairobi, but Ethiopia built this electric dam called Grand Renaissance Dam. They didn't get money from the World Bank. They didn't get money from China.
Oh,
It was mostly Ethiopians that put money over 30 years to build that dam, and they did it, and the Ethiopian community, the Habesha, they call themselves Habesha, for them to take that those 3 decades to do that shows you the power of the diaspora, right? And there are 3 countries that I always mention when I talk about diaspora engagement. That's Ireland, Israel, and India. I think for Africa, because we're part of the Commonwealth system, I think I try when I talk to ministers or a government official, and they say, yeah, we're trying to get more of our diaspora to invest in our country, or to invest, or to come in. And I said, well, if your embassy or consulates overseas, are you doing a brown bag lunch or TEDx to identify who in your global diaspora can help you, especially if you have a natural disaster? Morocco had a natural disaster a year ago.
yeah.
In their global diaspora have backgrounds in civil engineering or disaster risk response, so that they can call upon them. So this is why I started the DCI Diaspora Country Index. I'm hoping in the next 4 or 5 years, somebody from a Western multilateral or Western donor, or even the World Bank, or even the UN, can say, well, look, a funny guy named Nii Simmonds, he developed this index. In the past 3 years, you've been falling down the list, and for 20 years, we've been funding your healthcare program. But what are you doing to engage your diaspora, especially in healthcare, to support your development outcome, right? So that's the purpose of DCI. It's a Peace Corps for diaspora engagement. We have an index. It's sort of like a think tank, but a do think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Nii, thanks so much for that question about, I know it's a little bit off topic, but I think it's really
No,
cool
no,
to
no, no. Thank you for answering because I mean I'm trying to promote it, and that's why you know.
I just want to say, I think it's very cool that the sort of through line through our conversation, whether it was talking about the status quo in Africa with critical earth minerals, whether it was about developing infrastructure, or whether it was about DCI and helping countries leverage their diaspora, it's always been about sort of capitalizing on connections and being able to really use what already exists in terms of pre-existing structure and capitalize on that and develop new relationships. And so I guess for a final question, in terms like how important for you is it, do you think, for the development of relationships between people really to sort in any of these disciplines, whether it be in tech development, knowledge transfer, or helping communities leverage their diaspora communities. Like, how do you think? How important would you say, also in your personal experience, is it to be able to build these long lasting or meaningful relationships?
Sure, sure. Great question. And I'd be remiss not to say this. So DCI is focused on the African continent first couple of years. After we've gotten the model, we've proven the model. We want to open up the aperture to other
Yeah.
emerging frontier markets, Latin America, South Asia. We want any country that is emerging, who is not utilizing a diaspora to look at their diaspora as a force multiplier. Good country. I always mention this country, India. I'm fascinated by India. I love the food. Yesterday I went to a Diwali party, but because of COVID, everybody now knows that India is the number one manufacturer of vaccines. Well,
Yep.
why is that? How did India, you know, come from a country? I mean, there's so poverty in India. Let's not get it twisted. But how did India get to the point where it's the number one producer for vaccines? And I mean, think even some OTC drugs. Is there diaspora? The diaspora that went to University of Warwick or University of Edinburgh in Scotland or University of Rhode Island or University of Connecticut in Michigan. Those are the Indian government has the Indian diaspora has is a it's a force of nature. I mean, look at the tech companies. A fifth of the tech companies are, I mean, Google, Microsoft, Micron, Indian diaspora,
Right.
right? I mean, so I'm hoping that in maybe 20 years, somebody who's in high school in Africa comes here and then he or she becomes can emulate, About your question in terms of the intersection between, advanced manufacturing, innovation, and engaging one's diaspora. How are these important for partnership? Is very important. I mean, if you look at there's no country in this world that hasn't developed by partnering with somebody and then utilizing their diaspora. They don't look at it they don't call it diaspora, but diaspora engagement is very important. There are people who if you're once somebody leaves their country and they're abroad, they're sending money back, but they're also over time providing technical assistance and mentorship. And this is a partnership that a country has to harness, right? In the age in a we live in a globalized world. We are connected through we saw what happened with COVID, how COVID exposed us, our social fabric, and how we live and what have you. But guess what? It also showed us how we can help each other by partnering so that we can develop that vaccine that was developed, mRNA. Those two individuals were Turkish diaspora who were living in Germany, and they partnered with Biogen. They partnered with Pfizer to develop this. And actually, that's a great story. Those two Turkish immigrants that were educated in the West, they probably wouldn't have gotten the idea or even the know-how if they weren't educated somewhere in the West. So these are things that matter in terms of using innovation, science, and diaspora engagement to solve local global challenges to make the world a better and harmonious space. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Nii, thanks so much. I think this is a great note for all of us. Regardless of what discipline you're going into, it's important always to leverage these relationships, leverage your diaspora communities, and make sure that, we can sort of track and capitalize upon these things that folks are learning outside of their country and bringing that back in. Folks, one more round of applause for Nii. Nii, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to learn about Africa and all the partnerships that are coupled there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me. Thank you Pranav and Brandon, and I'm looking forward to be engaged with you guys further. And anything I can do to support your efforts, let me know. Thanks for having me this afternoon. You have one question, I guess. One more question.
No, I think that was applause, but
Oh, okay. Sounds good.
You're good, you're
All right,
good.
guys. You
Thank you
guys
so
take
much,
care.
Nick.
Thank you,
All right,
brother.
see you soon. Bye-bye.